So thanks everybody for joining the January 27th EPPAC meeting. As I said, we have a packed agenda today trying to close out stage one of the capacity expansion modeling results with the NISO here to present the last three sensitivities from stage one. There's a lot of detail in here, and there's actually even a couple of the sensitivities that have a couple of twists and turns in them, almost multiple sensitivities in the same modeling run. So I encourage everyone to pay kind of close attention, ask clarifying questions if you have them, and we'll try to go slowly and clearly through all these modeling results so we can get everybody on the same page. But with that, just want to get as much time to the presenters as possible today with all the information. So I'll just pass it over to the NISO now.
Thanks for that, Skylar. Our primary presenter today going over these sensitivities will be Kevin Ravis, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Skylar. Can y'all hear me and see my slides here?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so this is Kevin Ravis with the NISO, here to present results on sensitivities 8 through 10. And I do agree with Skylar that there's a lot of material to go over here, lots of results. So I'm going to try and go over things as slowly and clearly and concisely as possible. Try to give some context where needed on assumption changes and things like that. But yeah, if there are any questions as we go through, feel free to let me know. We can talk those through. But very similar to our last EPPAC meeting, I will be going over the sensitivity overview and assumptions, and then get into the comparison and analysis of our three sensitivities for today. And then just for reference, there's additional appendix material available with additional sensitivity results for you to review. And so the purpose of the presentation is to go through sensitivities 8, 9, and 10. And just remember that sensitivities are used to examine the impact of particular changes that have been identified by the joint utilities and requested by the joint utilities. So these changes will be applicable to previous CGPP scenario assumptions. And I'll be going over the assumptions in the following slides, but just for reference, we presented several other sensitivities at previous EPPAC meetings, and those results are available at the links that are here in the slides here. So let's get into the overview of the sensitivities. So we have in the tables in the next two slides here all of the sensitivities that we've done. And so we have sensitivities 1 through 5 in this slide, as well as sensitivities 6 through 10. And so 8, 9, and 10 will be going over today. And I think the most effective way to kind of get into these results, or sorry, the assumptions, is to go over them as we come to them. So I will get into the details and descriptions of each, but just as the preliminary overview, we're doing sensitivity 8, which looks at the impact of electrolysis. And then we're doing sensitivity 9, which looks at the inclusion of 2039 targets, particularly 90% and 95% zero emission targets in 2039. And then finally, we will be looking at sensitivity 10, which does look at a scenario without the Clean Path New York transmission project. So let me start off with sensitivity 8, this impact of electrolysis sensitivity. And so here I'll go over the assumption changes in detail, but I also want to provide some additional context. So sensitivity 8, the 8A here, is based off of the state scenario and includes changes to electrolysis, both from the rest of economy perspective, as well as there's a electrolysis associated with generators as well. But the fixed rest of economy electrolysis, as it was modeled in the state scenario, is an annual target, and these annual targets are based on assumptions from the NYSERDA's integration analysis. And it's a target that basically grows the amount of electrolysis that must be served throughout our model horizon. And we allowed the model to optimize when that electrolysis load was served. So as long as the annual electrolysis amount hit the specified target, the model could choose when to serve that electrolysis load. And what we've changed in this sensitivity 8 here is we're actually fixing that amount. So we're saying that the annual energy targets for this rest of economy electrolysis, and again, rest of economy meaning things outside of the electric sector, like maybe for transportation, hydrogen use for transportation or other industrial processes. So we're assuming that this electrolysis is a fixed amount, so fixed hourly electrolysis load for all hours within a model year. So just taking that amount and dividing it by the number of hours within the year. And this, as I had mentioned, this electrolysis load is going to grow according to the assumed annual forecast, but remains constant on an hourly basis. So that's the fixed portion of the electrolysis. And then we also have electrolysis that is optimized and connected to the hydrogen defer generators that we have within the model. So if a defer, like a hydrogen defer generator wants to run in our case, the model has to add electrolysis load to sort of balance that generation, as well as that hydrogen generation, as well as like the sourcing of the hydrogen, which requires that electrolysis and the additional load. So to not over-constrain the model here, we ended up continuing to allow the electrolysis for hydrogen powered generators to be optimized by the model. So that portion is not fixed because it could lead to saying, okay, we're going to fix the generator electrolysis, which would also fix the amount of generation from those units, and we didn't want to constrain it in that way. And then finally, there's a little bit of a zonal distribution element here as well. So in the state scenario, the model optimized and made the decision on where the electrolysis load was being served. And just as a reminder, that was limited to zones A through E. So the model could pick anywhere within that zone to place the electrolysis load. But in this sensitivity, we have fixed this amount. So we've fixed the rest of economy electrolysis, and we've distributed it amongst the zones proportionally according to the zonal native load in model year 2042. So I know that was a lot, and I guess, are there any questions before I move on to the next sensitivity assumption?
Yes, Kevin. Bill Acker here at Best. Question?
Yeah.
So a couple questions related. First of all, the zonal distribution, was that all zones of the state or just upstate that you distributed based on load?
Yeah, it's just the zones A through E. So
Okay.
similarly to us limiting it to those zones, we still limited it there, but ended up just like fixing the amount instead of letting the model choose.
Makes sense. Okay. The other question is around, and this is a question both for your optimization for the electrolysis for the generators and also for the optimization that was done for the electrolysis before you fixed it in the previous scenario. How much what utilization factor are you assuming when you allow the electrolysis to model to pick the electrolysis to timing for the electrolysis to meet the load, the hydrogen generation? I mean, is there a limit on, does do they have to have like a 50% or 80% or 90% utilization factor electrolysis equipment to the number of hours you have it off effectively?
No, we didn't really constrain it in that way. Like there was no sort of utilization, like minimum utilization required. So we did not get into that level of constraint on it.
Okay. Do you have a rough sense of utilization for the for those two? I guess I just want to test. I mean, the balancing act for people that are trying to do electrolysis is the capex of the equipment versus how, you know, how much you run it. And so, you know, if you're buying capex equipment, you want to run it all the time, but then again, you're also very sensitive to electricity price. And so it makes a lot of sense to not run on high cost electricity times, and that's that balancing act you're doing here. Do you have a sense of how much utilization it has? Because obviously, if it has like a 1% utilization, it's not realistic from a capex equipment point of view.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I see where it's coming from and what you mean, but we did not look at it at that level of detail. So I don't really have a good answer for that.
Okay. It would be great if you could just dig out, you know, what the utilization was for those two cases, and just maybe share that afterwards.
Gotcha. Yep, thanks.
Kevin, this is Anna Summer from Energy Futures Group on behalf of WEACT. I had a couple follow-up questions to what Bill was asking. I guess first of all, in the utilization, one could get some sense of that by looking at the capacity factor of the DFERs, right?
You certainly could, but the electrolyzers would be serving this this rest of state economy load as well. So there's a mix of both there.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Can you talk about how you represent, well, there's as I recall, there was a discussion a few months ago, and I think Skylar said something to the effect of what you'd be looking for is to make sure that the electrolysis load is kind of balanced by the amount of generation, amount of new resources that are added in the model, so that you can be sure that you have the energy you need to actually perform electrolysis. Does that continue to be kind of the way that you figure out whether you've represented the correct amount of electrolysis load compared to the, you know, right amount, so to speak, of generators within the portfolio?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've certainly looked at this and validated it before, right? Like if the model is going to use the DFER, it has to add the electrolysis load, but that also means it's going to have to add additional resources to meet that load when it's demanded. So we've certainly looked at it in the past, though admittedly not recently, like, you know, when we're coming up with the assumptions to begin with. So does that help answer the question, or what can I clarify?
No, that does help answer the question. I guess the main thing I was wondering is if dividing the load across all the hours evenly would have some impact on the resource portfolio apart from the timing. Because it seems like it must. I mean, even if I think you're running low duration curves, right? You're using partial chronology. So it seems like there must be some impact on the level of resources that are in the portfolio, if not the timing. Does that make sense? Am I following the breadcrumbs correctly?
I think you are. And I'm hoping that maybe some of the results will help answer that a little bit, because you are right that the timing is definitely an element that we're going to go over here. So it should.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that was one of the main reasons we wanted to do a scenario like this, because previously we were getting a lot of alignment between electrolyzer runtime and solar production, especially in upstate, where it was kind of infinitely flexible, just able to produce whenever is most convenient for the model. And we wanted to test, what happens if, as things currently stand today, these are just businesses. These are loads interconnected to the NISO that don't right now have to have any flexibility. What if we go all the way in the other direction and there isn't necessarily control, and they are, as Bill was saying, high capital resources that want to just get built and run. So this is the opposite alternative. And now, instead of perfectly aligning when we have lots of energy, what happens if they're just fixed? And it's going to hopefully show, how those resource mixes change in that scenario to kind of make up for the fact that now you're having a lot of electrolysis load potentially overnight or potentially on summer peaks when you might not have had it before. That's what the results will hopefully make clear.
So that makes sense from a just sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? That sounds reasonable. But I guess what I'm sorry, I'm thinking through this as we're speaking here. I guess I'm not understanding exactly how you would see that in the model, because I don't. If you're just running partial chronology, then you've lost all the chronology in the model. It's sort of a mislabeled time sampling setting in Plexus. But I guess I don't know if you are doing any sort of like global slicing so that you do actually put some hours together in a chronological fashion.
I see what you're saying now. Yeah, the individual days are not necessarily strung together, but within the individual days, there was a clear preference for kind of maximizing electrolysis during those peak solar production times and those high renewable output times, and that impacted the amount of defers you need, the amount of storage you need to match the renewable flexibility, all that good stuff. And so within each individual representative day, the electrolysis is not allowed to follow that least cost most optimal pattern. It was just squeezed to basically be flat across the entire day. So you're right, it doesn't kind of show in how it would be in reality where all the days are strung together and all that type of stuff, but it does have within each of those representative days, there is no more like optimistic shape for electrolysis production. It's all flat across all the representative days.
Yeah, it's not just the days not being connected, it's the hours not being connected. Because what you're doing is sampling hours within each day. And I guess if what you're saying, Skylar, is that you are seeing like a preference for particular resource because of this change, then maybe there is something about the time sampling settings that's giving you some level of chronology. But I guess that's sort of what I'm missing is like how do you get what you're looking for out of this scenario if there is no chronology embedded in the model?
This is Sarah Karkner from the NISO. I can chime in here. So I do want to confirm the time settings that are used in the capacity expansion modeling for this phase 1 analysis does use sample chronology in Plexos. And really what that means is that there are representative days that are, weighted across the year based on different conditions, but within each representative day, chronology is preserved.
Okay.
Where chronology is not preserved is between each of those days. So, it's not like a full week or a full year per se, where it would, flow hour by hour throughout the entire time frame, but each day does have that chronology preserved. I hope that helps clarify a little bit.
Yes, it does. I was totally going off in the wrong direction. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. And let us know if you have any other questions on that.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all. Yeah,
I think we just have one more question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Kevin. Yeah.
Hey, Radhika Donaldson here. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. I do have a question, and maybe it's a very basic one, but I would like to have this clarification on the sensitivity. So you are representing additional load for the rest of the economy. So are you saying that these load projections are not included in the main load, or are you splitting in the load forecast, or are you trying to separate this based on the potential behavior of this load segment? I'm trying to understand what the more like high level, what the sensitivity is and why we are doing it. And sorry if I missed the key point of this.
No, that's a great question. And yes, this rest of economy electrolysis load is like separate and distinct from, you know, like regular zonal load. And it does behave differently in that we don't specify like an hourly demand. It's like the model can choose when to serve this rest of economy electrolysis. So it is kind of like a separate and distinct thing that the model optimizes for or has optimized for in previous scenarios. But in this case, we're keeping that fixed instead of allowing the optimization, but it's still like the same amount of energy that's associated with it, like the annual target for that amount.
Okay, thank you. Helpful.
Cool. All right. Thank you for the questions. And with that, I'm going to just talk about the second part of sensitivity 8 that we did. And it's just a little different in that this case is, this part B case is actually relative to is based on scenario 3. So the high transmission impact scenario. And in this case, we took out the rest of economy electrolysis. So to see what that would do to have that amount of demand removed from the system. But we did keep the generator electrolysis within the model and continue to be optimized by the model to not over constrain things. And again, because there's still the hydrogen defer generator, and in this case, it's particularly the fuel cells within this case. So are there any more questions on the assumptions? I feel like once we have an understanding of the assumption changes, the results begin to look intuitive. So that's why I want to make sure we address these up front if there's any more. All right, hearing none. So let's get into the results here. So for sensitivity 8A, this is the fixed rest of economy sensitivity. The results are showing that with that demand being fixed and applied to the state scenario, we see that it is being served by a combination of solar during midday periods, as well as battery defer generation and net imports and exports during like shoulder periods when the solar is not available. So this contrasts with the state scenario where electrolysis was mostly being served by that midday solar. And so the primary difference in generation is occurring during the morning and overnight periods. And there's minimal change to the NICA level capacity and the zonal capacity distribution. So the primary change that's happening here is this rebalance. If I had to put one word to describe this case, it's a rebalance of how the demand is being served by the resources. And so when we look at a snapshot of 2042, here's where we can see that from a capacity and generation perspective, there's not a lot that's changing. And that's the same on a zonal perspective. But let me get into the delta slide of the NICA the NICA capacity and generation over time. And here's where we can see that when we compare the two, this fixed rest of economy sensitivity has a slight offset of the defer capacity for more batteries. And then the battery and defer generation helps to serve the electrolysis off peak. And we wanted to show that how that balance occurs by using our representative days figures. So just to give a little bit more context on what's being shown here is you may have seen our representative days figures in the past, where we show how the generation looks across the days within the model. And this is for the state scenario, as well as for our new sensitivity, where we do the fixing of the electrolysis here. And that's represented by the dotted line shown here. And what we did is we took a delta of that and to show how the generation and our resources were changing. And I took the two most simple examples to highlight this. So that's why I just have the high energy, low solar, high wind day, as well as the winter peak. And so we're saying that the change in electrolysis demand is balanced by batteries, imports, exports, and defer generation. But what that looks like in our new case, compared to the state scenario, is we're seeing more electrolysis load in overnight periods. So things get a little tricky here. So more the negative electrolysis means that there's more load because just the signage here. When we have more of a negative element, it's indicating more load. So we have more electrolysis load in overnight periods, both in the morning and in the evening. And then we actually have less electrolysis demand in the middle of the day. And so it's being redistributed into the evening and morning. And then that electrolysis demand is then being served by more defers, as well as some batteries and or pump storage, and then the net imports and net importing here. And the same sort of story in the evening. And then in the day, during the daytime, it's just choosing to charge the batteries in order to meet that electrolysis later. And it's a very similar story for the example on the right here, but I think this one highlights the balance the best. So hopefully that kind of highlights that point. If there's any questions, I can take them quickly.
Go ahead, Bill.
Sorry,
you have a question?
I was muted. I'm sorry. This is Bill Acker. I started talking. I realized I was still on mute. Bill Acker, New York West again, Kevin. I'm curious, can you tell from the modeling how often this sort of scenario is going to exist of the nighttime running the defer to chart to make hydrogen? Is this something that is on your kind of extreme load case stays only, or is it most of the time?
So are you meaning more from like what was in the state scenario?
Well, I was thinking more of in this scenario, because in this scenario you're going to have that nighttime running of defer to make the hydrogen because you redistribute the hydrogen, the electrolyzer timing.
Yeah, trying to find the best figure to answer that, but like this figure might help with that the best. I mean, this is the let's see. So you're trying to understand when the defer generators are going to be used to serve the electrolysis load. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, in the modeling, to me, the one thing that stood out was that the defers are a lot of times running in the mornings. And I think a lot of that has to do with the logic in the model, where the storage might not be charged yet. And so the storage is either getting charged earlier in the day or being used later in the day, and the defers are showing up to the left on the left side of most of these individual day slices in a big way. But storage is used throughout most of the day here.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess what I was thinking about here is, and I think it makes sense, Skylar, your point that because we don't let energies, we're doing 24-hour snapshots and starting the batteries at zero state of charge, we're running defers in the morning to charge batteries, which probably wouldn't happen if we had a longer time horizon than 24 hours in the model. But what I'm also wondering about particularly is, I mean, if you just step back from a logic and physics perspective, it makes no sense at all to run a hydrogen defer to make hydrogen. I mean, the round trip efficiency is probably only about 25%. So you're using 3 parts of wasted, 3 parts of wasted energy for every part of energy. So that cycle is incredibly inefficient. So we would never want to run a defer in order to run an electrolysis unit to make hydrogen at the same time. You definitely would just turn the hydrogen electrolysis unit off, even if you had to pay them a fortune to do it. So this is, and I realize you're doing bookends here. You're doing it's how I described earlier. You're doing the optimize it or totally don't optimize it, and the reality probably someplace in between, where we would use some sort of SCR program and not run the electrolysis during that time. That's what I was trying to get at. Is this something where the model results are probably close to reality, and reality would be, on 5 days a year we turn the electrolysis units off, or is this a case where we actually are seeing that a lot and we probably would have to rethink it a little bit?
Yep, that's a great point, Bill. And I think some of the things we are seeing, like on the winter peak day and the peak morning, we are running defers like 2,000 megawatts additional for like 8 hours. And the only change we've made is moving electrolysis to those times. So it's exactly what you're saying. We're on a peak day, we're running defers to make sure we can, make the energy up that is running electrolyzers. And so that is something that we know now, that there's some cutoff between, our base case scenario and this scenario, where there's a cutoff where once you start limiting the flexibility of electrolysis, you get to the point where you do need like defers to step in, like emergency energy to step in to create the hydrogen. And so we need to introduce some flexibility into those electrolyzers to get to the quote unquote optimal mix.
Yep. Makes sense. Thanks.
Go ahead, Anna.
I had a question following up on our time sampling discussion, and based on these charts, when you say representative days, does that correspond with the days that are sampled, or is there a different way that you choose these representative days?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the representative days, very high level, what we have assumed in the model is 13 unique types of days. 4 of them, which you'll see on the far right of this figure here, are going to be your seasonal peaks and something that's like a near peak. These are pre-defined up front to capture some of those more extreme days. And then the other 9 days are going to vary by year and by scenario, and it depends on the different type of system conditions. So we don't have the full legend split out here describing what each of these days are, but if you look at like the day on the far left, LE, LS, LW, that designates a low energy, low solar, low wind day. And each of the representative days are going to be a various combination of either low or high energy, solar, and wind, to come up with the various different system conditions that it could be, to be representative for what a year could look like. And then the model determines how many days are like that should happen in a year, and that designates the weighting on each of these slides here. So there's really 13 like unique types of representative days that are modeled for each given year.
Okay, and those are selected before you start the modeling, and then you
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
but they could be different from scenario to scenario.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, if one scenario, if there some factor that would influence one of these, they could be different. But yeah, they're determined up front before a scenario.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks for the discussion. So just continuing on with the results here, the next few slides, I think the story is kind of similar where with this change, we are seeing minimal impact. So minimal change to upstate and downstate capacity compared to the state scenario. Similar on the zonal basis, not much changing here. And even we can see a delta between the two cases on a zonal basis, seeing that not much has changed. And the on the headroom side of things, with the increase, so there's some increases and decreases to the upstate headroom here, and it correlates to the redistribution of this rest of economy electrolysis according to native load. So how we've fixed this load distribution as opposed to letting the model do that optimization itself. So that's the reason for the slight changes here. And then minimal changes on the storage capacity side, as well as on the defer capacity. So again, the key word here is that rebalance, and shown best in the representative days figures. So that does bring me to the end of sensitivity AA here. So we can move on to the case where we remove the rest of economy electrolysis, unless there are any other questions on this one.
Kevin, just a real quick question, Bill, again. Just on the headroom, so I just want to make sure the headroom increased with 8A, right?
It looks like the overall headroom, I don't know that an increase is exactly right. It looks like more just moved around. So for example, like there's more in A and just less in B, C, D. Again, as a result of just placing that electrolysis rather than doing the optimization.
So I guess what I'm trying to make sure of is so when you place the electrolysis in a zone, you're increasing the load in the zone, and that effect would be to increase the headroom. So if electrolysis went down in a zone, the headroom will go down. If electrolysis goes up, the headroom goes up. Is that what you're seeing in the model?
Yeah, and that's directionally right. Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Right. So with that, I will move on to sensitivity 8B here. So with this case, again, it's based off of the scenario 3. And when we remove the rest of economy electrolysis from that case, it's a removal of approximately 20 terawatt hours of demand in 2042. And so some electrolysis does get added back as the model re-optimizes for the electrolysis tied to the defer generation. Plus there's some additional battery charging that occurs in this case. So it leads to a net decrease in demand of about 14 terawatt hours. And this decrease in demand primarily leads to a decrease of 4.6 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, and then an associated 19 terawatt hours of offshore wind generation. And that's specifically in zone K. And with the decrease in energy from offshore wind, both fuel cell, defer, and battery show slightly higher utilization to support energy needs when other resources are not available. So aside from this decrease in offshore wind capacity in zone K, there are minimal changes to the zonal capacity here. So this is showing the 2042 side-by-side comparison, but let me get into some other slides to go over the details. So here's where we can see the change over time on the NICA level. We see that decrease in offshore wind capacity from the decrease corresponds to the decrease in load, and then again the decrease in the offshore wind generation. And then, but there is some addition of DEFR and battery generation to make up for some gaps where the offshore wind is removed. And here's where we can see the upstate versus downstate comparison, again, primarily looking at that decrease in offshore wind capacity downstate. But one of the things that we did look at in a little bit more detail is the transmission flows for this case. And part of the reason for this is, so the rest of economy electrolysis is being served in zones A through E, right? So why does it lead to a decrease in capacity in zone K? And so we looked at the transmission flows to sort of get at this question and give some insight. So what's being shown in the chart here is both flows and hours congested. So let's look at the solid orange line is the flows for scenario 3. And then the solid blue line is the flows for this sensitivity 8B on the UPNI-SENI interface. So UPNI-SENI being an interface that sort of represents or represents like the flows that are coming from or the flows that are happening between upstate and downstate. And then we also looked at the hours congested. So dotted orange being scenario 3 hours congested and dotted blue being this sensitivity. And both flow and hours congested are outputs from the capacity expansion model. And hours congested indicates the number of hours the interface is flowing at minimum or maximum. And just like a reminder that the capacity expansion model doesn't have a detailed, it's a pipe and bubble model. So it doesn't have an overly detailed representation of the transmission system, but we are able to get some flow information on the pipes that are between the different zones in the model. So just with that caveat here, but when we look at this, we see that the reduction in demand allows upstate generators to flow more energy downstate and therefore offset the need for some of that offshore wind capacity. So despite the decrease in demand happening in the upstate zones, we're seeing more flow, sending the energy downstate and allowing for a decrease in offshore wind capacity, which, if you'll recall, has the highest build cost of all the capacity expansion options. So that's likely the drivers, the capital cost, and instead using resources that are available upstate. So the flows, as we can see, have increased from upstate to downstate compared to the state scenario. But this also comes at the expense of more congested hours on this interface. So hopefully that provides some context and insight on how it's actually decreasing that offshore wind. So are there any questions on this part?
Would just understand what the congestion means in this. So am I reading this right, that in 2042 that we're seeing in the 8B scenario, we're seeing that more than half the hours of the year you're at maximum flow? Is that what that more than 5,000 hours of congestion means?
Yes, that's right.
And so does that just mean you're at maximum flow, but everything in the model worked, or does it mean there's an issue?
Yes, it means maximum flow, but everything within the model was able to work.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay,
One more question on the phone, Monica?
thanks. Yep.
I have a clarification question on the prior slide 28. When we talk about upstate generation, and I have in mind renewables in particular, are you still enforcing, you reduce the demand, but the renewable targets, the clean energy targets, are they applied on the reduced demand, or I guess you have the same amount of renewable generation, but you just split this demand between demand that is not from the rest of the economy and demand from the rest of the economy. So you have the same amount of renewable energy that is essentially forcing the model to meet the targets. And this is why maybe you have that extra generation going up downstate.
Well, the targets would still apply to any demand that's on the system. So like the 70% renewable target would still be applied to that electrolysis demand. But because that demand has gone away, it's just finding that the resources that were built upstate for those targets are still needed and wanted due to their low, like build cost. But now you've freed some of that up to serve some of the load that is downstate and was previously being served by the offshore wind. So did that help?
Yeah, I guess I think maybe what's critical is in that first sentence on the slide, the fact that making this change in the demand, electrolysis demand, it's actually reducing demand in zone A and E. Even if overall you have the same demand, but you have less demand in upstate, and you build the same amount of renewable upstate. So I guess it goes to serve demand in zone K downstate.
Yeah, I think you got the right idea there.
And one other question, this chart is very insightful with congested hours on the interface, and I don't remember seeing this for the other sensitivities or even for the state scenario. Would you be showing this for the state scenario as well? And I'm asking this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm asking this because, for instance, I think one of the purposes of all those sensitivities is also to understand if that bulk process is being triggered, and for consideration of bulk upgrades. And I think this piece on congested hours of various interfaces is critical for that consideration, but I don't remember seeing this before.
Yeah, understood. And we found that this information was specifically like necessary and applicable to this sensitivity. So we don't necessarily have any intention of getting at this level of detail for the other sensitivities. So anyone else can feel free to comment on that, but I don't think there's any intention to do this type of analysis for the other cases.
Thank you. I guess maybe it's a question that I can ask at the end and more maybe on the DPS side, Skylar, like, because there is a component there, like a bulk process that if based on those sensitivities, there is some perception of benefits from doing bulk upgrades, the order was creating that path for a consultant work on bulk upgrades. And I think we kind of like we haven't discussed that piece. So kind of bringing that back to what the order is asking, to me the question would be, so with all those sensitivities run, what's next on that particular item of, should there be considered a bulk process in parallel to the work that is being done in subsequent stages by joint
Sure.
utilities?
Yeah, we can come back to a future EPAC meeting to discuss that type of information, but I agree that like any information we have about congestion is very valuable in terms of identifying potential areas to focus on for bulk. The one downside is that this is just kind of a fairly high level capacity expansion model. So the hourly congestion is not necessarily like the most quote unquote precise or accurate level. It would be much better to look at production cost modeling if we could ever get any of that. But this is still valid information that hopefully we can kind of dig into more later, and we can discuss it at a future EPAC meeting more about the kind of the bulk work that's happening on the back end.
Thank you.
Hey Skylar, this is Shadab with Nextera.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we support this request from Rodiga. We will also want to know. I know I made this comment last time as well, like from these sensitivities, how do we understand the bulk need? And it's probably your next step, but we definitely want to understand that piece as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. That's one of the tough things about the capacity expansion model. We don't allow it right now, at least in this cycle, to choose expansion of bulk interfaces. We just kind of monitor them. And as I said before, it's not the most granular from a chronological perspective or from a actual system perspective. So it's hard for us to get that much great information. We're trying to pair whatever we can get from this work with other work that's been done by the NISO to try to get a better sense of what's happening on the bulk side of things. And that work's kind of just getting underway, trying to dig into all that stuff.
Understand. Thank you.
All right, thanks all. So yeah, getting into, again, some more comparisons of the cases here. So this, the removal of the rest of economy electrolysis, mostly leading to that reduction of offshore wind capacity in zone K. And here's where we can see that again on a delta slide between the two cases. And in the headroom side of things, we're seeing that a decrease in offshore wind capacity does lead to a significant decrease in headroom in zone K. And then in some upstate zones, removing that rest of economy electrolysis also reduces the need for some generation during the midday peak, and therefore reduces some of that headroom need. And we're seeing minimal changes to the storage capacity, and then also minimal changes to the defer capacity. And then just on the representative days side, so the generation from the hydrogen powered defer still requires some electrolysis. We still have that piece in the model, though it requires less overall. But one thing to point out on this slide, and we've kind of talked about representative days a little bit, but just to add more color, is like trying to understand like the balance between the defer generation and then the electrolysis load that's being served. One thing that's important to remember is like there's the weighting of the representative days here. So for example, like you see a lot of defer generation, but the weighting is only this is only one day at summer peak, and then the same for like winter peak. And then we have some weighting of the near peak days versus like these days where it appears that it could appear that there's a misbalance between the generation, but just note that like there's a significant weight on a day like this that shows where a lot of this electrolysis load is being served. So weighting is key to to understanding this part. So with that, I can go ahead and get into the sensitivity 9. So the sensitivity 9 looks at the inclusion of 2039 targets. And let's talk about that a little bit. So sensitivity 9 does have 2 parts, again, like sensitivity 8, and it's based off of sensitivity 5. And I know there's lots of sensitivities to piece together at this point, but what sensitivity 5 had was the state scenario, but it included different defer options. So in the state scenario, we've had the hydrogen powered simple cycle and combined cycle turbines, versus sensitivity 5, we removed those and instead had the fuel cell defer option, which we had seen in scenario 3. So same assumptions for the fuel cell from scenario 3, and it's also allowed to be built in all NICA zones. But then we also had the high capital, low operating defer option in this sensitivity 5. And that allowed the high capital, low operating resource to be built in zones A through G. But there was a limitation on the amount of HCLO resource that could be built in zones F and G, and it only allowed up to 500 megawatts of that resource in F and G. So that's the key clarifications for sensitivity 5, key assumptions. And so we based sensitivity 9 off of that case. And in this case, we're modeling a 90% and a 95% zero emission target in 2039. And the purpose of this sensitivity is to clarify the sequencing of investments required to meet the full CLCPA compliance in 2040. And so basically that means we're trying to identify what the last units are that are needed to be introduced to meet this compliance in 2040. So sensitivities 9A and 9B are providing insights on how the capacity expansion results look in this 90% or 95% policy achievement case in 2039, and then also how what that last increment is, and also getting a sense of or an estimate of what that potential build cost could look like as well. So when we look at this compared to sensitivity 5, when we add the additional 2039 constraint, it has minimal impact on the results in all of our regular model years, so 2030, 35, 40, 42. So it's roughly the same result for all model years except 2039, where each case has its respective emission target. And so when that target is in place, we see that much of the fossil fleet, particularly the fossil fleet that's not impacted by age-based retirements, remains online through 2039, and it's there to support capacity requirements and also energy needs, but with lower utilization. And then by 2040, the remaining 15 gigawatts of fossil capacity is replaced with zero emission resources. And in the case where we have the 95 by 39 target modeled, to achieve that additional 5% emissions reduction by 2040, approximately 17 gigawatts of zero emission resources must be added between 2039 and 2040. And then in the 90 by 39 case, to achieve that additional 10% of emissions reduction by 2040, it's 18 gigawatts of zero emission resources. And so when we compare sensitivity 9A and 9B, so the 95 versus 90 target, The additional 5% emissions reduction is achieved by adding 1 more gigawatt of the high capital, low operating capacity, which operates close to 100% capacity factor. So that's why these two cases sort of pan out to be fairly close in terms of their capacity need, because you can get a lot of energy from the high capital, low operating resource. And in both cases, the additional emissions reduction between 2039 and 2040 is achieved by adding battery and defer capacity. And what this means is that the results are showing that a 90% or 100% emission target requires the same amount of offshore wind, land-based wind, and PV capacity. So you're primarily looking at the same amount of renewables, but with an additional amount of battery and defer capacity. And here's where we can see how things progress over time. So between the two cases, all of the model years except 2039 are roughly the same. And then we can see how the target affects 2039 for each case. So for example, on a capacity perspective, we see that fossil capacity remaining online. And then, but the utilization between or for the fossil is different within each case. So on a 90% case in 2039, the fossil is able to run more, but then in a 95 case, you see that fossil is about half of that amount and then made up for by other defer generators. And then this slide here is really getting at that last increment, right? So we have the 2039 installed capacity for both cases, both the 90% and the 95% case. And then we have the 2040 amount. So when it's 0 by 40. So we have a difference in the years happening here. And then we have that both from a capacity and generation perspective. And then we have the delta between the years between 2040 and 2039. And this is where we can see how the fossil capacity has to come offline to comply with the 2040 target. And then there's an addition of battery capacity and fuel cell capacity. So if the fuel cell here is now purple, we've broken it out. Fuel cell purple versus high capital, low operating is the dashed purple. And so we can see that additional resources need to come online. But then when we look at the generation side of the equation, we can see that most of the additional generation is being met by that high capital, low operating resource. And then the fuel cells and the battery are being used as well, but just with lower capacity factor, lower utilization rate. And that is because those like battery and the fuel cell are primarily going to be serving LCR and IRM requirements. And that high capital low operating is reliable for the energy portion. And then finally, I'll finish up my slide here for this section, and then we can address any questions. But also just looking at that increment of build on a zonal basis. So this is usually when I show a chart like this, it has everything on the same year. But just note that, again, this is 2039 for the 90% and 95% case. And then 2040 for the 0 by 40 numbers reported here. And we can see that when the 2040 target is in effect, we see that fuel cells must be built, right? And it's built in zones, the downstate zones where there are LCR requirements there, as well as additional battery upstate, there is fossil being retired between 39 and 40. So for example, when there's less fossil in upstate, more battery is necessary in zone E there, as well as the fuel cells. And when it comes to the high capital, low operating resource, it's that last increment is mostly being built in zone C here, but is also spread out amongst some of the other zones. So let me pause there. Are there any questions on this case?
Just one question, Kevin Billacker again. Just the D for the LCO, the high capital, low operating cost DFR, is, you mentioned that's running with a very high capacity factor. Does your model allow for more nuclear in the nuclear bucket? I'm curious as to whether it would do the same thing in the model without taking any politics of advocacy or not advocacy for nuclear into the question. This is purely a model question.
Yeah, we don't specifically like add any more nuclear to the model, but like high capital, low operating is meant to be a representation of several potential technologies, and I believe that like advanced nuclear could be one of them, but others can feel free to comment on that.
I mean, what I'm trying to tease out with the question, I'll just be direct, is it really a fluctuating DFR that's going up and down all the time to follow load? Or in the model, does it turn out that actually what you're finding is just base load really helps you, base generation really helps you?
Yeah, I think this question, you're right that the high capital, low operating does operate like a base load unit. And I'm pretty sure that we highlight this best in like the sensitivity 5 slides. So I think there's some additional information there to like prove your point, because I think we have slides that talk to that specifically. But you are right in saying that it is operating like a base load unit.
Okay. I mean, and I think we've had these conversations before about, we tried with the high capital, low operating cost DFR to represent both advanced nuclear and long duration storage, and within the limitations of the modeling that we have, we may not have been able to do that as well as we would have liked. So we still are strongly advocating for continuing to look more at the actual properties of those units and figuring out how we can actually optimize around those pieces. But it's kind of interesting that that's what you're finding here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say we are actively like looking into the better representation of like long duration storage as well. So probably not for this cycle of CGPP, but we are actively looking at that, and your feedback has been very, for sure.
Thank you.
Hey, one additional question, and might be the same question that Bill was asking. On this DFR, is it running a lot because you are assuming it like must run? You are like self-schedule kind type for most of its capacity, or is it being dispatched because it has a low operating cost?
Yeah, great question. We are not, it's not a must run unit. It is running because of that low operating cost. Yeah, so we're not forcing it or anything like that.
Okay. And for nuclear, just by comparison, do you have that the same, like your existing nuclear is running based on the low operating cost, or is it more like a must run in the model currently?
I'm fairly confident that nuclear is must run. Anyone on my team can clarify if that's not right, but the nuclear is different in that it is must-run.
Ed, maybe one comment. So if we look at the findings, what you are saying, what I'm reading at you are saying is that meeting the last 5% of emission reduction is not a big difference in the mix. However, this is on the premise of having this high capacity utilization differ. Like if you had a different technology to meet those emission reduction, your findings could be materially different.
Could I actually refine that? I just want to be clear. What this slide is showing, it's not that, you know, going from 95 to 100 is easy. I think what it's actually showing is that there's a tremendous amount of additional investment and capacity required to go from 95 to 100. What this slide is really showing is that going 90 to 95 isn't very difficult. One of the reasons we wanted to run this sensitivity specifically was because in a lot of the modeling results so far, we were showing in like 2035, the model was showing something around 82, maybe 80 to 82% zero emission. And it was staying the same, fairly similar from 2030 to 2035, and then all of a sudden jumping up in the last time step to 100%. And that doesn't give us great information in terms of the sequencing of investments and how many, what we're going to get out of that last batch of investments to get that final 18 to 20%. So we really wanted to test out, you know, more of a smooth glide path to 2040 to figure out which one of those investments were really being made for the first 10%, the first 15%, the last 5%, and how those all compare. And so what this is really showing is that to get to 90%, you have to do a whole bunch of stuff, but to get from 90% up to 100%, that's the left side of these charts on the right, where you need, you know, roughly 18 gigawatts of new capacity to get from 90 to 100%. But to go from 95 to 100%, 17 of that 18 gigawatts is just for that last 5%. And so that's showing that to get from 90 to 95, you only need basically, we're relying on, you know, 1 additional gigawatt of baseload resource. But really to get that last 5% requires batteries and deefers and, you know, all sorts of other things all around the state to hit that last 5%. So I just wanted to clarify what the slide was showing.
Thank you, Skylar. I think this is a point that Bill was trying to make, that deferred assumption is very critical. And I guess it's a critical assumption in the model driving results as well. But I do see the points that you made. But I think it's some of the discussion around this defer was the feasibility of this scenario or the sensitivity in effect, and how you would get there because of all the challenges we are all aware about the technology.
Right. So it's basically showing, you know, the comparison is, you know, high capital operating cost is kind of offsetting some gigawatts of solar and wind. So it's kind of showing there is that kind of trade-off, and they both come with some some difficulties in terms of land use and permitting and all those types of things, and technology readiness potentially even. So there's a lot to balance here, and this kind of gives us a sense of when do we have to start relying on these things? Like when are they kind of absolutely critical? And then back out from that date, how long do we have between now and then? And is it feasible? Right. So I think that's one of the big things we're learning from these sensitivities.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Skylar. Just one point on the discussion you just had. You know, the modeling assumptions, I believe we're looking at like 13 individual days over the course of a year. And I think as you kind of look at the trade-off between a DFR, especially a high capital, but also high operating capacity factor. You also need to at least keep a sensitivity to wind laws that could affect production, as well as solar production during especially the winter period, because they're going to create different gaps that need to be thought about that DFR potentially could fill. So it's just a consideration.
That's a good point. You know, the more layers and the more variability on day to day and week to week that we see in the load forecast, the more different types of resources have to be relied on. And, you know, the more variability in the load forecast and the more variability in weather years kind of starts to stress various parts of the system. And you need to be a little bit more flexible, or the model does. So we're hoping that these sensitivities are giving us a fairly wide view of some of those things, but there's still certain things like extreme weather and different weather years that we'll definitely want to incorporate into future analysis.
Excellent, thank you all. So if there are no further questions on this one, I can move on to our last one here, sensitivity 10. All right. So last but not least, we have sensitivity 10, where we looked at the removal of the CleanPath New York transmission project. And just as a reminder and for reference, the CleanPath New York project offered additional transmission capability from Zone E to Zone J. And also within our model, we assumed with CleanPath a reduction in the zones G through J and Zone J LCR requirements. And just a caveat on this. So we estimated a value of 650 megawatts of LCR reduction, and this was used in the system and resource outlook and also leveraged for this analysis, but it was not intended to it was not intended for incremental evaluation of CleanPath, and it's really just a high level assumption and would have to get into more of a technical study to really evaluate the impact of CleanPath on LCRs. But just for everyone's awareness of this, like the results of sensitivity 10 are dependent on this assumption. So this is kind of like a directional analysis of this. So outside of that, right? Okay, so we've removed the transmission capability from Zone E to J from CleanPath, and we've assumed that CleanPath does not have this reduction in the LCRs. So those are the two main points here, and all other assumptions remain consistent with the state scenario. So in the scenario or sensitivity, with less transmission capability from upstate to downstate from the removal of CleanPath, we're seeing more energy generation downstate, and that's coming from a slight increase in offshore wind capacity, as well as higher utilization of DFR capacity. And so we see the model is building about 400 megawatts more offshore wind capacity by 2042 when we compare back to state scenario. And also Zone J storage capacity is increasing by 1.3 gigawatts, and that's to support LCR requirements as a result of the removal of CleanPath's contribution to the requirement. And just also for more color here, the additional capacity to replace CleanPath is not built by the capacity expansion model until after 2035. So just to give you a sense of when this starts to impact the result. So when we look on the 2042 basis, not seeing a significant change, but let me again keep that one as reference and move on to these other slides here. But when we look at the NICA level capacity, and this next slide actually includes the delta between these two. So just the capacity and generation, we're seeing that additional battery primarily to serve the LCR requirement. But then also there's a slight increase in the offshore wind. So there's more offshore wind and deferred generation that's happening when we cannot flow as much energy from upstate to downstate. And then here's where we can see where that capacity is regionally. So more capacity downstate. And then finally, able to see that it's primarily leading to that increase in offshore wind in zone K, and then an increase in the batteries in zone J for the LCRs. And then finally on the headroom, there's minimal change there, as well as on the capacity for storage. Minimal changes in all zones except zone J, where we have the increase for the LCR. And then also minimal change to the deferred capacity. And that brings me to the end of my slides here. So I'll close out and we can take any final questions on sensitivity 10. But just for reference, we've documented where old materials are for reference. So feel free to reference this at any time. But yeah, let me take any questions that are left over here. Anything? Not hearing any.
All right, thanks for that, Kevin. We finally got a hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this. Do you have a graph similar to before where you have the congestion indicator? I think we asked for that earlier in the last call to show some indication of how the transmission flows would be impacted.
We do not have that prepared in any of the material today.
It would be interesting to see that. Kevin, do you mind if we can ask for such result, one slide of that for this scenario?
Yeah, I'll defer to Keith or Skylar on whether or not we're gonna keep going.
Yeah,
on.
so
Yeah.
Rod, at this point, all of this work has been done under the reps agreement, and that type of information is reps agreement between the NISO and the utilities. So if that work were to be provided, it would need to come through that standard request that comes from the state team to the utilities to the NISO. Having had some discussion of that in our conversations of this work prior to coming to EPPAC, I'm going to guess that the answer to that type of request is probably going to be that information would not be provided. But I wouldn't necessarily want to close the door to the state through the joint utilities providing us that request to provide that information. So I'd leave that up to them.
Thanks, Keith.
I'm not seeing any other hand raises, Kevin. So I think at this point, Skylar will pass the remainder of the meeting back to you.
Great, thanks. And if anything pops up into people's minds, after this too, feel free to reach out by email too. That's going to conclude today. The next meeting we have is 2 weeks from now, and we're kind of going to switch gears. I know we've inundated folks this entire month with modeling results, but I think we want to move more to starting to discuss process and next steps through the CGP in our next meeting, where the utilities will kind of be on deck to give some presentations. We will take back some of those data requests. I think I tend to agree that more data is better than less. It just remains to be seen which ones we're able to pull out now and present to folks versus which ones will have to be developed over time and used maybe later in the process or presented in a final report. So we'll take some of those data requests back, but that's going to be all for today in terms of presentations. And we'll meet again on February 10th to go over the citing methodology and the next steps. I see 2 hands just came up. I think Radhika, you're first.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know I'm trying to digest the results I just saw, especially the LCR threw me off how you included that into the analysis. Can you tell me what is your conclusion based on this analysis? Is there an LCR impact? Can somebody elaborate a little bit for me? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a tough question to answer just because in both instances, the LCR in the model was held as a constraint. So in both cases, we had to meet the LCR to solve, and the model did. So the answer to like, is there an impact? Removing the resource, I think Kevin said something like 650 megawatts was the LCR impact from removing it, and then the model had to re-optimize, and the way it re-optimized was by adding a small amount of offshore wind and another batch of energy storage into downstate. So then that was able to re-optimize to still let the model solve. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was very helpful, Skylar. Thank you.
Radhika?
Yes, maybe a couple of questions, Skylar, before we adjourn. Like in the last presentation, there was a CGPP timeline chart with the next stages, and something that was of interest to us to bring up is the EPPAC update that was shown. One EPPAC update in January 2025, and then a second EPPAC update only at the end of stage 3. And I know we have maybe a couple or at least one more meeting, but I would like to ask for clarification whether the expectation is that stage 3 will be completed and then EPPAC will be updated, or will there be a mid-stage EPPAC update, given that the stage 3 could be taken 10, 15 months, or at least 10 months, and there is critical work there about constraints and needs identified?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not 100% clear on when each segment of the stage 3 work is going to be done. There's just going to be a lot of ongoing work, and so we won't necessarily know when a good time is to have a meeting in the interim until we get a little bit farther along. I imagine it probably does make sense to have at least one interaction, maybe more, during that 10-month period, as opposed to having our next meeting and then just going silent until the fall or something. So we'll definitely take that back and try to make sure that when there's like information that's worth sharing or decisional information, we can come back and share it with folks. But right now I don't have a date on any of those things. It's just kind of, there's a huge bundle of work to go through in stage 3, and we don't necessarily have key dates for when different segments will be done yet. But we will have the meeting 2 weeks from now where the utilities can maybe answer some more of those questions, and we will be going over the citing methodology and stage 3 methodology in more detail. So maybe we can get some better answers 2 weeks from now.
Thank you, Skylar. So I appreciate the response, and I understand how much work is to be done in the subsequent stage, in stage 3. From my standpoint as an EPPAC member, I think the type of information that would be really useful and helpful for everyone here would be the top constraint, like the key constraints seen in each service territory, as this work is being advanced, knowing that it might be a draft, and then later on, like the solutions that are being more advanced. understanding that there will be a lot of iterations, but I think it will be very helpful to just get a sense of what are those constraints that you are solving for, what type of solutions you are looking at, and not wait until the end when there might be no, and I'm not, necessarily saying there will be a lot of feedback, but I think just from a update standpoint, it will be very appreciated.
Agreed. Thanks.
And sorry, I have one more question that maybe it can be responded in the next meeting. I think during the presentation on stage 2, and maybe stage 3, there was an emphasis on more analysis being done on or through 2035 versus after 2035. So it'll be good to discuss this piece more, like what is driving that. Because when we look at the capacity build out, there are big differences through 2035, after 2035, as we have seen in those sensitivities. And also, I understand, you made this point many times that we want to recommend doing all the upgrades on the system in this first cycle. But even from that standpoint of iterating cycle to cycle on what the needs and solutions are, I think it will be a missed opportunity to now look at beyond 2035. One, to understand the scale of the needs. Two, even if you don't approve everything, at least you have a track record for going into the next cycle and see, are those same needs, are the same solutions that could be applicable. And then, because there are so many needs scaling up after 2035, maybe some of those upgrades could be designed in phases with an expansion option, like double circuit that can be from 230 to 345, like if the needs are confirmed later on. So it just seems like we could be missing a lot of insights and good decision-making opportunity if we, and at the end, cost to expand the transmission system, if we are just focusing through 2035 in the analysis.
Oh yeah.
Right. I'd like to respond. This is Chris Schramm from NYSEG RG&E. We are absolutely going to be looking at after 2035, but the focus is going to be, so we're going to look at 2042 needs, things like that, right? The focus is going to be on designing projects and proposing them for 2035. You can imagine the amount of engineering work required to solve every need for 2035 to 2042 is a lot. So we want to focus on bringing projects within that 10-year horizon forward into the filing for the PSC, right? So we'll certainly be considering future needs and right-sizing projects, as it were, to meet the 2042 needs. But projects that are only needed for 2042 will not be our primary focus on this cycle. The generation out that far is far more speculative, and we kind of feel like, we're better served, and the customers of the state are better served, trying to meet the 2035 goals first. But I totally hear you. Yeah, it definitely makes sense that we should identify those needs so that, in future cycles, we can see, hey, did these show up again? I think that's good input.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. I think that it would be great to discuss, and it might be specific to some needs. In one, we have seen some of this in other markets where, you do an upgrade and then you have 200 more megawatts of generation in that area, and you need to build a whole new line. And at the end, the cost of the new line plus the initial upgrade might be more than if you had done the line to begin with. So I'm just wondering if that, I assume that will be part of some of your considerations as well, because if you have to do the upgrade anyway, or that's the maybe a more effective way to meet demands, just like drawing a hard line stop to 2035 needs might at the end be more costly at times.
Yeah, we're not doing that. We're not drawing a hard line to 2035.
Okay.
We're only going. It's so if there's a project that's needed in only 2040, 2040 plus, we're going to say, hey, we saw a need here. We have a preliminary solution for this, but we're not going to, bring it through the engineering rigor needed normally for like a project to get approved by, the PSC and ratepayers.
Yeah, I think you just touched on the key element here is that we want to know the full scope of issues and the potential needs all the way out to 2042. But in terms of rate case quality design for approval, we want to make sure we're maximizing the utility's time and effort and the commission's review and effort on things that are like kind of near term, more certain needs. And if there's some components of those things that seem to be guaranteed to be needed between 2040 out to 2040 and 2042, maybe those get developed too, or asked to be developed after the report. But I think we really want to be focusing a lot of the effort on developing, more granular information about the solutions that are required in all scenarios in the near term. And if there's time and effort, then maybe there's more done. But I think we're already pretty far into our schedule and trying to make sure we're using our time as effectively as possible. But certainly take the point. I totally agree. We're seeing that in a lot of our proceedings right now, where you want to measure twice, cut once, and make sure we're not just looking 2 years ahead and optimizing for that in programs, but seeing the full picture up front so that we can make sure we're building in optionality and expandability and those types of risk factors as we develop the entire system. So that's a really good flag, and we'll try to make sure we're doing that and keep showing up and keeping us honest.
Thank you. Look forward to the additional conversation.
All right, any final questions before we close? All right, sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.